We've concluded now our survey of the surviving gospel sources for reconstructing the life of the historical Jesus. With the partial exception of the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, the non-canonical Gospels will not be able to provide us with much additional information to what is already found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But even these canonical Gospels are problematic as historical sources, whatever their high merit as inspirational documents of faith. They were written decades after the events they narrate, by authors who were not eyewitnesses, who inherited their stories from the oral tradition, where the tales of Jesus' words and deeds had been in circulation for year after year, and where they were altered in the process. This brings us now to a further question. Are there other kinds of sources that can give us some historically reliable information about Jesus' life? That will be the subject of the present lecture. I'll divide our considerations up according to three kinds of other sources that we have. First, pagan sources. Again, remember that the term pagan isn't derogatory in this context. It simply refers to people who were neither Jewish nor Christian. So pagan sources. Secondly, Jewish sources. And thirdly, canonical sources that are outside of the Gospels. There are 4 Gospels in the New Testament, but 27 books in the New Testament, and so is it possible that the other 23 books provide us with some additional information. Since our concerns for this lecture series are strictly historical, we can restrict our search to sources that were written within 100 years of Jesus' death. That is, up to about the year AD 130. That's just an arbitrary number. I'm picking 100 years. But my assumption is that anything written long after 100 years is going to be based simply on hearsay and legend. 100 years is a fairly long time, after all. It's the length of time separating us from William McKinley, the 25th President of the United States. Anything having to do with McKinley presidency that we'd have today, if there were no earlier written sources, would be problematic, probably just based on what people had said through the oral tradition. I'm interested in historical sources that have some plausibility as being historically accurate. And so we'll restrict ourselves to a 100-year period. If Jesus died in the year 30, sources written up to the year 130. I'll begin with the so-called pagan sources. You would think that there would be lots of discussion about Jesus among pagan authors. Among his enemies, for example, Roman administrators, interested observers. In fact, there are scarcely any pagan sources of any kind that can help us reconstruct the life and teachings of Jesus. If people were talking and writing about him, we have very little record of it. From the 1st century AD, we have hundreds of documents that have survived, written by all kinds of pagan authors, for all kinds of reasons. We have writings of philosophers, poets, historians, scientists. We have numerous public inscriptions, and tons of private letters that have been discovered by archaeologists principally in Egypt. In none of this extensive literary record is Jesus ever mentioned at all. We not only have no birth records, or trial reports, or death certificate, we have no reference of any kind whatsoever, even to Jesus' name, in any pagan source of the 1st century AD. As enormous an impact as Jesus has made on Western culture over the past 2,000 years, in his own day, his impact appears to have been practically nil. That's just going on the basis of the written record, which, after all, is the only thing we have to go by when you're talking about antiquity. We have to go on the evidence we have, and that's the evidence. He's not even mentioned. Our earliest recorded references to Jesus in pagan sources come from the early 2nd century, about 80 years after his death. There are, in fact, only 2 certain references to Jesus from pagan sources within our prescribed time limits, AD 30 to 130. The first comes from the Roman governor of the province of Bithynia Pontus. Bithynia Pontus was a province in Asia Minor, which is now modern-day Turkey. The Roman governor of Bithynia Pontus in the early 2nd century was a man named Pliny, frequently called Pliny the Younger, to differentiate him from his uncle, Pliny the Elder, who was a natural scientist of some repute. Pliny the Younger wrote a number of letters to his emperor, the Emperor Trajan. In one of these letters, he mentions Jesus. It's a letter that comes from AD 112. The circumstance that provides the context for the letter is that Pliny was having some administrative problems with people in his province who were meeting together illegally. The Emperor Trajan had a fear of groups meeting together, social groups meeting together, and so he outlawed social groups from coming together. This had led to all sorts of problems in Pliny's province. They were outlawed in this particular province. It had led to a particular problem which one probably wouldn't have thought of in advance, namely that without the ability to have groups meeting together, there was no possibility of having a fire brigade. And it turns out that it led to enormous problems when a village would catch fire. They didn't have any way to put out the fire because they didn't have a fire brigade that would kind of meet and practice or do whatever fire brigades do. And so villages were burning down apparently. And so Pliny writes a letter to the emperor saying, there's some circumstances under which perhaps we should consider having the possibility of groups meeting together. In that context, he mentions another group of people that were meeting together illegally. It turns out that it's a group of Christians. Pliny describes this Christian group to some small extent, and it's a useful description for us because it shows us something about the character of Christianity in 2nd century Asia Minor. He mentions that there were people from various socioeconomic classes, for example, which is worth knowing. There wasn't just the poor who were Christians, but from a range of socioeconomic classes. He mentions a couple of women slaves that he tortured for information about the Christians, and so forth and so on. He gives us some information of use about early Christianity. He unfortunately doesn't tell us a lot about Jesus. In fact, all he says is that he identifies who these Christians were by saying that they were, quote, followers of Christ, whom they worship as a god. That's all he says. This is in letter 10 of Pliny the Younger to Trajan, written in the year 112. His major concern with this group, Pliny's major concern, was how to stamp it out. And so, it's useful to know that his interactions with the Christian group. It's not of much use for knowing anything about Jesus. All we find out from this is that Jesus had some followers who were called Christians. Pliny doesn't even actually use the name Jesus in this letter, simply the term Christ. Well, that's the first reference to Jesus. Obviously not of much use if we want to have some kind of external report about what Jesus said or did. The second reference we have is somewhat more useful for us. It comes from the writings of a person who was a friend of Pliny, the famous Roman historian Tacitus. Tacitus is well known for having authored a multi-volume work called The Annals of Rome. At one point in this work, which is a history of the city of Rome, Tacitus discusses an incident that had happened 50 years earlier. He's writing in the year AD 115. He's talking about the history of Rome and is discussing at this point what was happening in Rome under the Emperor Nero. Tacitus tells the story of Nero torching the city of Rome because he wanted to implement his own architectural designs for the city. And so the city was there to implement his own architectural designs. The city had to go, and so he himself planned the arson, according to Tacitus. Well, people in the city who didn't much appreciate being burned out of house and home began to accuse Nero of having performed this act. This is all taking place in the year 64, AD 64. Nero, in order to get the blame off of himself, decided that he had to find a scapegoat for the arson. And he found a ready enough scapegoat in the band of Christians who were in the city of Rome at the time, and who were evidently generally despised by the populace at large there. And so Nero had the Christians rounded up, charged with the arson, and executed in various ways. In the context of describing this event that had happened 50 years earlier, Tacitus mentions something about who the Christians were. I'm quoting the passage I'm quoting is found in my book on Jesus, the apocalyptic prophet of the new millennium, where I collect all of these sources together. Tacitus says, Annals, book 15, that Christus, from whom their name is derived, was executed at the hands of the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. Well, it's useful to know that Tacitus had this much information available to him. Again, he doesn't name Jesus. He mentions Christus, Christ, and he indicates that he was crucified, that he was executed under Pontius Pilate when Tiberius was the emperor, which of course coincides with the information we have from the Gospels. Even this particular reference isn't completely accurate historically. We've discovered just in recent years that, in fact, Pontius Pilate was not a procurator of Judea, that he was a prefect in Judea, which means that not only did he have the ability to raise funds, he not only had economic fiscal responsibilities in Judea, but he also had the ability to use troops. So he had military command as well. He was a prefect, not just a procurator. That's the extent of the reference in Tacitus. These are the only two references to Jesus in pagan authors for the first 100 years after Jesus' death. That's it. That's all that exists. We might turn then to a second kind of source, namely Jewish references to Jesus from the first 100 years after his death. Unfortunately, here again, our surviving Jewish sources are of little use to us in reconstructing the life of Jesus. We don't have nearly as many Jewish sources from this period as we have pagan sources. The main source for the history of Palestine from this time is an author that I've mentioned before in these lectures, a man named Flavius Josephus. He's our main source of information about Palestine, and as we'll see, he does refer to Jesus on 2 occasions. First, let me tell you something about Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish aristocrat who was born in 37 A.D., so just within a decade after Jesus himself died, and he lived until about the year 100 A.D. During the early days of the Jewish uprising against Rome, which dates from 66 to 70 A.D., it's a war against Rome that I'll talk about in a later lecture, Josephus was appointed to serve as the general of the Jewish troops in the northern part of Israel, Galilee, which happens to be where Jesus himself was from. Josephus and his troops were quickly overpowered by the Roman legions marching in from the north. They ended up being surrounded by the Romans, and they agreed to a suicide pact among themselves. Josephus and his troops drew lots to determine who would kill whom until there would be 2 soldiers remaining who then would take their own lives. It was a suicide pact so as not to be taken prisoner. As it turns out, Josephus himself tells us this in his autobiography that he wrote later in his life. As it turns out, Josephus managed to draw one of the final 2 lots. It's hard to tell whether it was rigged or not. And then, when all the other soldiers had killed one another, he persuaded his one remaining companion to surrender. He was brought before the conquering general, Vespasian. Josephus displayed a good bit of political savvy at that point by predicting to Vespasian that he, Vespasian, would become the next Roman emperor. As it turns out, he was right. Nero committed suicide, and after a rapid succession of emperors within a course of a year, where there were assassinations following one another, Vespasian was declared emperor by his troops. After the war, Vespasian rewarded Josephus for his prophecy by giving him an annual stipend and a residence in Rome, where Josephus spent the rest of his life producing a number of significant literary works that provide us with information about the life and history of his homeland, Palestine, including a lengthy account of the Jewish wars themselves, in which Josephus participated not only as a general, but then near the end of the war, he was used by the Romans as a translator to try and convince the Jews who had holed up in Jerusalem during the siege there to surrender. So he wrote a lengthy account of what happened during the war, and about 20 years later, he produced a 20-volume work on the history of the Jews that started with Adam and Eve, the first two human beings, and comes up all the way to his own day. This is a work that is called The Jewish Antiquities. Jesus is never mentioned in the Jewish wars, as you would expect, since he was dead before they began. But he does make two tantalizingly brief appearances in Josephus' work, The Antiquities. The briefer of the two references, Book 20, simply indicates that Jesus was called by some people the Messiah, and that he had a brother named James. Well, that coincides with what we have in the New Testament, but it doesn't give us much to go on. The longer reference, though, gives us considerably more detail and has been a hotly debated passage, probably the most hotly debated passage in Josephus' writings. I'll quote you the passage. It's found in the Antiquities. Again, I'm drawing from my collection of these sources in my book on Jesus, the Apocalyptic Prophet. Josephus says, Book 18 of the Antiquities, "At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one should call him a man. For he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following, both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. He was the Messiah. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading people among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. For he appeared to them on the third day, living again, just as the divine prophets had spoken of these and countless other wondrous things about him. And up until this very day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out." The reason this is a debated passage is because there are references in this that make it sound like Josephus himself was a believer in Jesus. At one point he says that Jesus was the Messiah. At another point he says that he was raised from the dead, as the prophets had predicted. That doesn't sound very much like a Jew who is a non-believer. I pointed out that during the Jewish war, Josephus had turned himself into the Romans. The corollary to that is that throughout Judaism after that time, Josephus was often thought of as a turncoat and a traitor. Jews did not preserve his writings through the Middle Ages. These writings were preserved instead by Christians. What some scholars suspect is that the Christian who was copying this manuscript of the Antiquities beefed it up in a couple of places. That the basic reference to Jesus probably was there, but that a Christian, in order to add his own faith statements and put them on Josephus' lips, had added the business about Jesus being the Messiah and his having been raised from the dead. Take away those references, and you still have some interesting information, namely that information that presumably Josephus himself provided in this account, that Jesus was thought to be a wise man who delivered interesting teachings, who was known to have done startling deeds, who had a following among both Jews and Greeks, who was turned over to the Roman authorities by the leaders of the Jews, and that he was killed by Pontius Pilate. after which a group of Christians, his followers, formed communities that first started out in Judea, then moved abroad, even to the city of Rome. Well, it's useful to know that the premier historian of first century Judaism knew this much about Jesus. I should say, Josephus gives us a lot more information about tons of other Jews living in his day, including lots of other people named Jesus. Jesus was a fairly common name, and he tells lengthier stories about other people named Jesus, so that it appears that in comparison with other Jews living in his time, at least in Josephus' view, Jesus of Nazareth wasn't all that significant historically. Of course, that verdict was overturned with the course of history, but that's what Josephus thought, writing near the end of the first century, evidently. It's also interesting to note that what Josephus says coincides with what we already knew from the accounts of the Gospels, and so it corroborates what we previously thought. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't give us anything more than we already knew. So the result is this passage can scarcely help us much if we want to reconstruct the things that Jesus himself actually said and did. Those two references in Josephus are the only reference to Jesus in any Jewish sources from 100 years after his death. References to Jesus, there are references to Jesus, I should add, in the Jewish collection of lore and learning called the Talmud. The heart of the Talmud is the Mishnah. The Mishnah was a collection of oral traditions about the Jewish law that were compiled around the year 200, so about nearly 2 centuries after Jesus' death. The rest of the Talmud consists of commentaries on the Mishnah. Jesus is never mentioned in the Mishnah. He's only mentioned in these commentaries on the Mishnah, which were first written down in the 5th century A.D. So even Jesus does appear to be referred to several times in the Talmud, but these references are hundreds of years later, and so they aren't of much use for us historically. That's it. That's all we have from Jewish sources. Just to give you a brief subtotal, when we're looking at pagan sources, there are 2 very brief references that tell us almost nothing, except that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and 2 references in Josephus. Outside of the Christian sources for the 1st century after Jesus' death, that's all we have. Well, we might finally consider one other group of sources, namely other books of the New Testament outside of the 4 Gospels. Unfortunately, here again, these books tell us very little about the historical Jesus. They tell us a lot about what Christians believed about Jesus in terms of his ability to bring eternal life. They tell us a lot about how people ought to behave and what people ought to believe. They don't tell us much, though, about what Jesus said and did. The most prolific of our New Testament authors is Paul, to whom is attributed 13 of our 27 books of the New Testament. Paul, though, gives us very little information about the historical Jesus. Let me give you a list of what Paul tells us, and this list is meant to be exhaustive. Paul tells us the following things about Jesus. Galatians chapter 4, verse 4 says, "When the fullness of time came, God sent forth a Son who was born of a woman, born under the law." Well, okay. So Paul knows that Jesus was born of a woman, which is, I suppose, useful information, but one wonders what the alternative might be. And secondly, he knows that Jesus was born under the law. In other words, he knows Jesus was Jewish. Third, Paul indicates in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5, that Jesus had brothers. In Galatians chapter 1, he names one of his brothers as a man named James. Paul, fourth, indicates in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus had 12 disciples. Fifth, in Romans 15, he indicates that Jesus ministered to Jews. Sixth, Paul gives 2 of Jesus' teachings, that his followers should not get divorced and that they should pay their ministers, from 1 Corinthians 7 and 9. Paul also knows the sayings of Jesus at his Last Supper, 1 Corinthians 11, and he knows that Jesus had a Last Supper, and he describes the events there, 1 Corinthians 11. He indicates in that passage in 1 Corinthians 11 that Jesus was betrayed. Finally, ninth, Paul indicates that Jesus was crucified, 1 Corinthians chapter 2. That's all Paul tells us. It's not much, but it's something. Unfortunately, there's nothing there that we already didn't know from the Gospels. There is one other source from the New Testament that I should mention that, technically speaking, is not a gospel, that probably, though, provided our Gospels with some of their material. This is the much discussed but hypothetical document called Q. The term Q comes from the German word Quelle, which means source. German scholars who developed the idea that there was once a gospel that had been used by Matthew and Luke that no longer survives simply called this source the source, Quelle. So it goes by the short term Q. By way of background, let me just explain that our first Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are so common, to have so many stories in common with one another, that it's appeared to scholars for 1,500 years that they had some of the same sources. In other words, they probably copied each other or copied something else. Since the middle of the 19th century, it's been widely believed that Matthew and Luke both used Mark as a source. That's why they'll sometimes tell the same stories using exactly the same words. And they'll often tell stories in the same sequence. Matthew and Luke both use Mark. Well, Matthew and Luke have other stories, though, that aren't found in Mark. Where did they get those stories from? It doesn't look to most scholars that Matthew used Luke or that Luke used Matthew. There are complicated reasons for thinking that they didn't. Where did they get this other material from? Well, maybe they got it from another gospel that no longer survives. This other gospel that no longer survives is called Q. Q is almost completely sayings of Jesus. In other words, the material found in Matthew and Luke, not found in Mark, is almost all sayings. It includes some of the best-known sayings of Jesus, including, for example, the Lord's Prayer, found in Matthew and Luke, not Mark. Where did they get it from? From this other lost source. It includes the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, etc. There are only a couple of narratives in all of the Q material. Q, then, appears at one time to have been a source available to Matthew and Luke, so that when Matthew and Luke agree with one another against Mark, we can hypothesize that they're relying on an earlier source that no longer survives. You can reconstruct that source, then, and use it as an independent bit of tradition about Jesus, independent of Mark, for example, which apparently didn't use Q. Matthew and Luke had other sources at their disposal. There are stories found in Matthew that don't apparently come from Q, because they're not found in Luke, and they don't come from Mark. Well, where did Matthew get these stories? Well, he had some other source. And so scholars simply call this other source M, for Matthew's source. M gave Matthew things like the visit of the wise men to Jesus when he's an infant. Same thing applies to Luke. He has some stories not found in Matthew, so they're not from Q, and not found in Mark, so they're not from Mark. Where did he get these stories from? Well, he had his own source. Scholars call Luke's source L. That would include things like the parable of the Good Samaritan, or the parable of the prodigal son, found only in Luke. Well, so that comes from another source. This means then that Matthew, Mark, and Luke had four sources that were used. You've got Mark as a source, Q as a source, M as a source, L as a source, and it appears that all four of these sources were independent of one another. Q, in particular, has attracted people's attention because it appears like it was a lot like Thomas was, a collection of the sayings of Jesus. It can't have been Thomas, because a lot of the sayings in Q aren't in Thomas and vice versa, but it's that kind of document. Most scholars think that Q was written at least by the time of Mark, possibly sometime earlier. Most scholars date it maybe to the 50s, possibly the early 60s AD. If they're right, then it would represent our earliest source for the life of Jesus. Let me wrap up this lecture. We can say that apart from our canonical Gospels, we don't have a large number of sources to help us reconstruct the life of Jesus. Pagan and Jewish sources, such as Pliny, Tacitus, and Josephus, at least let us know that Jesus existed and that he was known to have been crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. But they don't tell us anything about what he actually said and did. Other books within the New Testament, including those by Paul, don't give us much biographical information about Jesus' life. But at least we know of a previously existing source, Q, which we can reconstruct to some extent by looking at places that Matthew and Luke agree in material not found in Mark. Moreover, we know that other sources existed, including Matthew's source M and Luke's source L. In our next lecture, we'll begin to consider how we might use these various sources to help us get behind the portrayals of Jesus they contain, to recover historically reliable information about what he actually said and did.